Hello and welcome to Heroic Media. I'm Michelle Bauman.
And I'm Patrick Cordova.
This week on Heroic Media, the U.S. Supreme Court legalizes same-sex marriage nationwide.
Pope Francis says respect for creation and human dignity go hand in hand.
And Catholic author Jason Evert explains the Catholic response to transgenderism.
Stay tuned for all these stories and more here on Heroic Media. So here at Heroic Media, we explore news headlines that deal with foundational moral issues, especially issues that revolve around family, marriage, and life, and they're topics that are just very important to society, especially today.
Exactly. And some of the topics that we often touch on include abortion, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, human cloning, and homosexual marriage.
Right.
So Patrick, what's our first story today?
Okay, in our first story, in a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court of the United States legalized same-sex marriage. The June 27th ruling cited the 14th Amendment, saying that same-sex was a constitutional right and that all states must recognize same-sex marriages. So this was, something that we had been talking about on the show here for a little bit, right? We saw it coming. We knew some sort of decision was going to come, and we thought that it would come during the summertime in June. And lo and behold, it came. And I personally can't say that I'm surprised. I was obviously let down, disappointed in the ruling, and yeah. So I mean, those are my first initial thoughts. What were yours? Yeah,
I thought it was very interesting. Again, like you, I wasn't surprised. But when I read the ruling, I thought it was very interesting. Some of the points that it made, and very problematic.
Yes.
And there's a variety of reasons for that. There's some concerns about religious freedom, some statements about children. One thing that was interesting was that the majority opinion mentioned contraception either directly or indirectly at least 5 times that I counted. And so there were several references to the Supreme Court case 50 years ago that sort of paved the way for widespread contraception. But then it also at one point basically said, well, we already know that marriage has nothing to do with procreation and children because contraception.
Yep.
And so it very clearly makes that case. And we've mentioned many times on this show that we've been paving the way for gay marriage. It didn't come out of the air. We didn't just wake up as a society and redefine it one day.
Yep.
But that we had this mentality of marriage that's been broken down through contraception, divorce, prenups. These kind of things are really breaking down our understanding of what marriage is.
Yep, I absolutely agree. And that's kind of one of the things that I thought about in my mind and have been thinking about is, like, well, how did we get here exactly? And because I think some people may have been surprised more than others. And some people, were just like, oh, it's not really that big deal. It was interesting to watch all the reactions. But one of my thoughts, or I guess reactions, was like, how did we get here? And yeah, I agree with what you said. I think that it was not something that happened overnight, although this development happened kind of relatively quickly. Like the public opinion has changed quite quickly over, like, it seems like the past 4 or 5 years. And so so that was what was most surprising to me, how quickly the thinking changed and the polling and everything on the issue of same-sex marriage. But yeah, I was like, how did we get here? And I think you're right. There was so many factors. There's so many factors that built up over time. And yeah, I think absolutely contraception has a huge thing to do with that, right? Because the thing that Catholics believe about marriage is that it's unique, right? It isn't a union between a man and a man or a woman and a woman. It's unique that it's a man and a woman, and that union can produce children, right? And so absolutely, once 50 years ago when contraception became legal and everything was, contraception was widespread, you took that aspect of what a marriage is out, right? And so it kind of started chipping away at what marriage is and how people felt about it and how people felt about relationships and family and children. And so when you get, the deterioration of marriage over such a long period of time, it completely, when you look back at the history and the progression of events, you can totally see how people are confused about marriage and what it is and how a ruling like this could happen.
Right, absolutely. And I think it's important that you noted how quickly the public opinion has changed. And yet, if we look at polls today, Americans are still split fairly evenly on this issue. There's almost 50%, according to most polls, who are opposed to gay marriage. And, and there has been, we've seen a very heated public debate about this in recent years. And what happened in this ruling is essentially you had 5 people, 5 unelected officials basically say we're shutting down that discussion, the debate is over,
Yep.
everyone has to accept this, every state has to recognize this.
Yes.
And the consequences for that have been quite drastic, that shutting down of discussion. I've seen it so many times since that ruling, people being accused of being bigots.
Yes.
You're so bigoted, you're so prejudiced if
Right.
you hold this belief, which about half of Americans believed, and
Right.
almost everyone believed a couple of years ago.
Yes.
And that to me is very troubling. There's troubling implications for religious freedom. I looked up bigot, I just Googled bigot to see what the definition was.
Yeah.
And it said that a bigot is a person who is not tolerant of people who have different beliefs. And I thought that's not applying to our side.
Ironic, yeah.
That is ironic because I disagree with gay marriage, but I've disagreed with gay marriage for a long time, and I've never told anybody that they don't have a right to hold their belief if it's
Right.
different than mine. But now what we're seeing is these people who are saying, you have no right to have this view or to express this view. You need to stop having this view. And
Yep.
several of the Supreme Court justices actually said there's going to be problems here. Justice Alito,
Yes.
who's a Catholic Supreme
Yep.
Court justice who disagreed with the majority, he said that the decision will be used to vilify Americans who are unwilling to assent to the new orthodoxy and will be exploited by those who are determined to stamp out every vestige of dissent.
Exactly.
So there's some very concerning things here for religious liberty.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you pointed out what one of the justices said. Another one, John Roberts, said, "The majority's decision is an act of will, not legal judgment. The right it announces has no basis in the Constitution or this court's precedent. 5 lawyers have closed the debate and enacted their own vision of marriage as a matter of constitutional law." I mean, so I'm glad that at least some of the other judges felt the same, the justices felt the same way about that, but it still doesn't obviously affect the outcome. But yeah, I mean, even they could recognize that, hey, this is not the way it's supposed to go. This is ridiculous. Like, it's not, has no basis, and it's just awful. And yeah, what's next? Well, who knows, right? But obviously the conflict between the recognition of same-sex marriage and religious liberty are all but inevitable, according to one of the justices. So.
Also, within 5 days, there was already a claim for polygamy. There was
Right.
somebody filing for a polygamous marriage and saying they would file a lawsuit if that wasn't recognized under the same logic
Yes.
of, oh, well, it's all about love anyway.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see what happens, but there will be consequences, and we will be seeing them pretty rapidly here,
There
I
will
think.
be. Yep, there's a lot to talk about.
Absolutely.
All right, in our next story, Pope Francis's new encyclical on the environment slams attacks against human life, including abortion, embryonic experimentation, and population control, saying that respect for creation and human dignity go hand in hand. So this was kind of I guess it was talked about a lot for a lot of friends that I have that are non-Catholics, kind of secular folks, and it was because it got a lot of the focus on this obviously was about environmental issues. A lot of the focus was on things other than, when I was reading this, things that I thought were really important or things that stood out. And so this was in a 184-page document, and it was, the meaning of the document is "Praise be to you" is the title. And so it was nice to see the Pope talking about the environment, I think. And also I liked how he tied in a lot of moral human issues into how that affects the environment and how it kind of precedes like us caring for the environment, I guess. That's what I kind of took out of it the most. What about yourself?
Right. I think those points are really important, and I think they were largely overlooked by a lot of the media and a lot of Catholics. There's a lot of focus on the statements on climate change and people going back and forth and some controversy there. But there was a lot in this encyclical, and one of the things is the connection between human life and how that plays out with environmental concerns. And it's really important. One of the things that the Pope says is a sense of deep communion with the rest of nature cannot be real if our hearts lack tenderness, compassion, and concern for our fellow human beings. And he talks about the preeminence of the human person, which means that as much as we should respect God's creation, nature, the created world, the human being, the human person is preeminent because we have immortal souls. We're created in the image and likeness of God. The human being is worth more than that, and we have to respect the human if our respect for the created world is going to be in balance.
Exactly, and that was one of the things he talked about. He was, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he was basically like, it's very incongruent, I guess, to say, oh, I care so much about these animals, yet you don't care about a human embryo or a human person or someone, a human being in whatever form that human may be, young, old, small, big, tall, whatever. You must care about human life before you can care about other life. And so he said that we have to make sure that we that not all of our focus is just on animals, but that we also have a focus on human beings and caring for human beings. And for the reasons that you just stated, right? It's not that we don't care about the environment. We clearly should, and he says that. But he says in order to care about the environment, we have to take a step back first and make sure that we are caring about our fellow human beings. And for the reason that you just said, right? You said, humans have a mortal soul. And we, human beings, were created in the image of God, right? So we have a higher order, a higher level of respect due to humans than to like a tree or an animal, right?
Exactly, and he sort of plays out some of the concrete implications of this for us. He has some very direct statements. He says that concern for the protection of nature is incompatible with the justification of abortion. Basically saying, how can we care for the environment when we're not caring for these vulnerable human beings right in front of us?
Yes.
Even from the embryonic stage, if we fail to protect a human embryo when its presence is uncomfortable or creates difficulties. So that's a very strong pro-life statement right there.
Absolutely, and that was one of the things that stood out to me. Just that thing too, because it seems like especially when something someone is causing us some difficulty, that it just becomes convenient for us to throw it away, which kind of ties into the whole environmental thing. And I know he mentioned let's not be so wasteful too. He talked about a lot of different things, right? But it does tie into that whole mentality of, oh, if you're not useful to me, then I can just waste whatever and waste you or waste it and get rid of it. And that's kind of that habit, I guess, that we've had in society today, that kind of a throwaway society translates into not taking care of the environment as well.
Exactly. And he applies that point to embryo research as well, that we can't just discard these embryos as if they're matter to be experimented with. And population control. He says that the problem in distributing enough resources and goods to people is not the people themselves.
Yes.
And he says demographic growth is fully compatible with an integral and shared development. We can't see people as the problem here. And he also has a strong family statement. He says that family is the heart of the culture of life. So lots of really pro-life concepts in this encyclical, lots of richness here in this document.
Absolutely, and I like that you brought that up too, because it really ties all the things together. And I like how they're all related and they all tie to the environment.
Right.
It was a good read.
Absolutely.
All right.
Coming up after the break, we'll hear from one commenter on how Catholics should respond to transgenderism.
Stay tuned. Hello and welcome back to Heroic Media. In case you're just joining us, I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman. In our next story, as transgenderism gains attention in the headlines, it's raising questions of the proper Catholic response. So this is definitely something that's getting a lot of attention.
Yeah, it has. It's been in the news headlines a ton lately. And it's a good question, right? Like, what is the Catholic response supposed to be to this? It's a tough topic. It's a tough thing to discuss with people. How do you approach people? What are the right things to say? And I'm glad we have a guest on to discuss that. So.
Right, absolutely. I had the opportunity to speak with Jason Evert, a Catholic author and founder of the Chastity Project. Let's take a look at what he had to say. Jason, it is really an honor to have you here on the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
So to start off, what does the church say about transgender issues?
Yeah, that's something I asked myself recently, like, has the church even said anything on it? So I began digging into the literature. Benedict has talked about it, Francis has talked about it, more specifically in the general terms of gender theory, that this is basically some subjective thing that you can choose at will. And look what Francis said. He said, I ask myself if the so-called gender theory is not at the same time an expression of frustration and resignation, which seeks to cancel out sexual difference because it no longer knows how to deal with it. And he said the removal of the differences, in fact, creates a problem, not a solution. Now, Pope Benedict Emeritus had said that, according to this philosophy, sex is no longer a given element of nature that man has to accept and personally make sense of. It's just a social role we choose for ourselves, and in the past it was just chosen for us by society. And so the church is teaching that God has given us our sexual identity, created as male and female, and we should not invert this order thinking that we can recreate ourselves in whatever sex we choose.
So given this teaching and this idea, what is the proper response for a Catholic to someone who says, hey, I'm transgender?
Well, the church, when it treats people doesn't look at them as, okay, are you a gay, are you lesbian, are you transgender? The church thinks there's really three kinds of persons. There's divine persons, the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit. There's angelic persons, the holy angels and the fallen angels. And then there's human persons who are made in the image and likeness of God. And so we should be identifying ourselves as children of God instead of by our sexual attractions or how much I identify myself as a male or female. So we just need to really be careful that we're not identifying ourselves with something less than we truly are. And so the Catholic response needs to be treating the people with charity and love, but part of love is speaking the truth.
Why isn't the loving response to just say, okay, I accept whatever you want? If you think that this is going to make you happy to live this lifestyle, okay, I'll accept it. Why is that not the proper response?
Proverbs 27 says, faithful are the wounds of a friend. And if someone sticks a knife in you, he could either be a robber or a surgeon. He could be killing you or taking your life. And so to speak someone the truth sometimes brings about a little bit of personal injury. Like, well, wait a minute, you're telling me I can't live however I want? But what we've got to understand is there's gender identity questions are along a whole spectrum of other issues people struggle with. Some people have what's called species dysphoria, where they say, you know, I have the human body, but I identify with an animal, a cat or an eagle. That's really who I am. Some people will say, I have a body dysmorphia where I look at myself and I struggle with anorexia and I just see fat. I'm just fat. And it's like, well, no, you're 6 feet tall, you're 89 pounds, like you're not fat. And people say, well, why can't you just accept her for who she is? Give her some diet pills, let her live the way she wants to live. Sometimes truth is helping people to see the reality of what their body truly is. You know, and as Benedict had said, sometimes that involves, you know, struggling with it a little bit, wrestling to understand what this means to be made male and female.
Absolutely. And the church also tells us, though, that we should avoid unjust discrimination.
Yeah.
So how do we find that balance between, on one hand, not discriminating, but then on the other hand, witnessing to the truth?
Yeah, I think it's important that we treat these people as more than a problem. I think so often you hear Bruce Jenner, Caitlyn Jenner. All you think about the man now is Vanity Fair or his Diane Sawyer interview. You don't think about him as a man who believes in God, a man who cares for his children, you know, a man who has talents and hobbies and gifts. You just think of the gender thing. And I think it's so important that when we love people like this, we realize that they're a lot more than this issue. And if someone were to help me with my vices by just going after them, well, Jason, you struggle with pride and lust and avarice and gluttony and impatience, and let's fix that in you. I wouldn't want anything to do with that person in my life. I want someone who takes an interest in me as a human being, that realizes that I'm more than the sum of my issues. And so when we have people like this in our life, perhaps, we need to treat them with love and dignity and take an interest in their whole life instead of an obsessive interest in this one issue. And so I think when we treat them as human persons instead of problems and issues, we're going to make more progress showing them the love that God has for them.
Absolutely. I think that's key. And unfortunately, our society doesn't see it that way. Society, on one hand, does tend to fixate on sort of the sexual identity and orientation. And on the other hand, says that to love someone, you have to affirm everything that they do, even if it's not true. Do you see any implications from that? What are the consequences of a society that doesn't witness to the truth?
Well, I mean, without being apocalyptic, we have to be sober in our assessments. It's not simply a matter, well, just let them live the way they want to live. I mean, how does that really impact you day to day? We've got to look at this on a more global sphere. Pope Francis was doing one of his impromptu press conferences while he was flying from the Philippines over to Rome, and in it, he spoke of this ideological colonization. And the example that he gave is that there was a woman who's a minister of education in a developing country, and she wanted to get a loan to buy schools, to create schools for the poor, to educate them. So she went to the government with this idea, and they said, look, we'll loan you the money to build schools for the poor if you teach our book on gender theory to the young people there. And so Pope Francis saw this, and what he realized and what he said about this is that each people has its own culture, its own history. Every people has its own culture. But when conditions are imposed by colonizing empires, they seek to make these people lose their own identity and create uniformity. And so I also saw this when I was in Honduras. I met with a woman who was a delegate to the United Nations on pro-life issues. And she said, you know, whenever the Obama administration sends someone down here to talk to our government, one of the first things they always address is, what are you doing to promote the rights of the GLBTQ community here in Honduras? So forget about the drug cartels, forget about the lack of education, the poverty and all this stuff. Now, what are you doing for this issue? And so we've got to realize it's not a matter of letting people live as they want to live, but imposing this on a global this global scale. And I think the person who struggles the most in the end with this is going to be the children. Because if we think, well, male, female, it doesn't really make a difference. You could have 2 moms, 2 dads, or a dad who thinks he's a mom. I mean, it doesn't really make a difference, because if there's no real male, female, there's no real family in the end. And so the child, instead of being a subject who has his own rights, becomes an object to which people have a right to obtain. That I don't have one of those kids, I want to have them. And the kid loses his own right to have his own biological father and mother. And so the consequences are drastic. And so it's important that we learn to love these individuals and treat them with respect and dignity, but give them enough dignity to be able to uphold the church's teachings and God's plan for male, female, and the family.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you brought up children, because I think so often they're forgotten from this whole conversation.
Absolutely.
Jason, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Wow, that was a great discussion that you two had. I think one of the things that stood out the most to me was just remembering the whole person, right? It seems like so many times we just focus on this one aspect of that person, right? Who they are sexually attracted to. And that becomes who they are completely, right? And so it's just with people that have same-sex attraction, it seems like, or some sort of gender confusion, like that becomes their identity and it consumes them, right? But with heterosexual people, nobody's says they're defined by their heterosexuality, right? I mean, so I think that's a good point, that we're not just dealing with this one aspect of them, they are an entire person, right? And that kind of ties into the whole truth and love aspect, right?
Yes.
We must, and we must talk with them, and we must have both the truth and the love. We can't have the truth without the love, because just the truth sounds like you're just yelling at them and that you're making statements like, you have to do this, you have to do this. But if you just have the love, then we tend to forget about the truth, right? We just say everything's okay, we generalize it.
And that's not really love.
And that's not really love, right? Exactly. So I think those are some really good points, and I'm glad that you had that, that discussion.
It was a great opportunity.
All right, stay tuned. Coming up after the break, we have one more story.
Welcome back to Heroic Media. In our final story, 50 years after the Supreme Court paved the way for widespread use of the pill, one blog looks at the impact on our culture.
Yeah, this is a good topic because this will obviously be from more of a Catholic perspective and things that are not talked about on the news, right? And I guess amongst just social circles in general.
Right.
A lot of times when the pill or contraception is talked about, it's just like, oh, it's this awesome thing, and it's, I mean, I guess nowadays it's just taken for granted, and it's just what you use. And so I think that it's good to look at some facts that are not talked about very much and how that affects us too. So I guess we'll start with the first one.
Sure.
The first thing is America gained a Class 1 carcinogen. So that's one thing, that hormonal contraceptives are labeled as a Class 1 carcinogen.
Right.
And so that's really good for women, right?
Well, just as good for women as tobacco and asbestos and UV radiation, and this is a classification by the World Health Organization. So this isn't some, crazy conservative religious group. This is the World Health Organization saying, hey, this is really bad for you.
Yes.
And yet it's socially expected that all women are going to pump this into their body for years and years. So, there's risk of cancer, stroke, heart attack, all kinds of things with this. It's very scary.
It is. And I think today we're so used to seeing all these warnings and labels that we just kind of are like, whatever. And I think that most women probably, they either don't realize that it's a Class 1 carcinogen, I think the vast majority don't, or that it's just one of those little labels that you can just safely ignore at the bottom because they have to put it there to cover their own butts, right? So, but really, I think it speaks to the volumes, especially women that do know that it's a Class 1 carcinogen, people that I've talked to, and they still continue to take it because they would rather have cancer than have a baby. And I think that's
shocking.
Really sad.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. Another concern, there's research out of Harvard and UCLA suggesting that the pill might be shrinking women's brains, specifically the parts that help them respond to emotion and memory. So kind of important parts of our brain. That's also very alarming.
Yeah, it is. And I could see how that would disrupt relationships as well, right? Because
Certainly.
having, affecting your emotions in ways that aren't natural and normal, I mean, it can cause all kinds of problems, right? Not to mention just like your biology is changing, right? It's making you more masculine. And so none of those things are good for a woman. And emotional swings aren't good for anybody, but I mean, I can see how having, taking the pill and leading to those things can affect relationships.
Right, absolutely.
So the third thing is that women have gotten worse at selecting good genetic matches as mates. So this is an interesting one as well, and I think it ties into the whole big picture of, as we talked about earlier on the show, 50 years ago, the introduction of the pill, everything legalization, widespread use. And then, of course, the increase in divorces, right? And so it affects like hormones and scents and all kinds of things that affect your interaction between a woman choosing a good mate. And so because of the hormonal chemicals that are pumped in your body. And so that's obviously bad. It's almost like if you're on the pill before you meet somebody, and then you meet them and you develop a relationship, decide to get married, then you get married, then you go off the pill to have kids, then things fall apart. It's almost like, the pill could have been the cause for that, because you weren't really marrying the person that you thought you were, because they were different when they were on the pill. And so I think that it's a pretty scary thing too.
Yeah, more science coming out about that, regularly.
Yeah.
Another thing, we're shocked by basic biology. Now, if a woman gets pregnant and she wasn't planning on it, she's shocked because she had this security blanket, essentially, this insurance policy that said you won't get pregnant.
Right.
But guess what? Sex is where babies come from. And sometimes, no matter what form of contraception you use, no matter what you're doing to prevent it, sometimes that happens.
Yep.
And if you're expecting it, or if you're saying, yes, this is a possibility, I'm going to accept this as a possibility, then you're prepared for that. And if you're saying, no, I never thought this could possibly happen, then you're going to turn to abortion, or you're going to be in an absolute state of crisis.
That's right. They're all linked together, right? And then I think the biggest thing too nowadays is that women are told that the most important part about their health is their ability to avoid having children. And it's labeled under reproductive health, right? And things like that. And it's not about reproduction at all. It's about stopping reproduction.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, why is that the most important thing? Why has that been put on such a pedestal? And that's the most important thing about women's health, is not being healthy, like
is stopping
your body from forming, from performing naturally and normally. I think it's just crazy how backwards everything is, and how it's justified and put on this nice label so that people like it and are attracted to it.
Absolutely, yeah. Definitely things that people aren't aware of, and that we need to have more awareness.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for this week on Heroic Media. Please join us next week for all the up-to-date news on the pro-life issues that matter to you.
Please feel free to write to us with any comments, questions, or news tips at news@heroicmedia.org.
And please visit our website at heroicmedianews.org, where you can check out more stories like the ones we discussed on this episode.
That's all for this week. Until next time, keep us in your prayers.
God bless.